This wasn't the at-issue we had planned for tonight, but that all changed, of course, with the sudden passing of Jim Flaherty. Everybody is here at the table tonight. Not sure quite how I want to start this, but I guess what struck me was watching the feed out of Ottawa and how question period was suddenly canceled, and the stunned and shattered looks on the faces of politicians of all stripes today when they were getting the news and trying to, fathom it. And what it kind of said about that place, because we spent a lot of time in here dumping on all of them all the time.
When something happens that suddenly and when the person involved is that well liked, it kind of cuts through a lot of the artifice of politics, and you actually saw people behaving, I think, with a measure of grace and spontaneity and genuineness. When you see people like Stephen Harper, Thomas Mulcair, in Toronto, Rob Ford, pretty tough customers, all of them, basically reduced to tears, that tells you how, as I say, how well liked Jim Flaherty was. But I think it also says it was a recognition of a life well lived. I mean, it's hard to call it a tragedy. I mean, it's far too young. But I think part of what was affecting people was just, as I say, admiration for a life well lived. Just not in terms of its achievements, but also just the way he carried himself, that happy warrior persona.
I think everyone who is in politics and who is deeply committed to politics, and that is the case of most MPs, thinks that at some point when you hang up your skates, you're going to get to live another life or some part of another life. It is something you wish for yourself, and it's something you wish for the people who are not in your party or who are sitting next to you. And to see Flaherty robbed of that, I think that also made it hard for the people in the House of Commons. And remember, this Parliament has had, more of its share of tragedies than others. You start with Jack Layton, and now Jim Flaherty. These are two of 5 or 6 major characters in the House struck at times when they could either have enjoyed another life having built on success, or in the case of Layton, at the height of success.
And I guess that really is part of the tragedy, if you will, if you want to go down the tragic root of this, is that sense, and we've all seen it, either had friends or our parents had friends who seemingly within weeks of the biggest decision of their life to step away from the jobs they had, to retire, to resign, and then boom, like that. It's just terrible. Bruce?
Well, I am struck by the fact that something like this happens and people in politics are reminded of context and perspective and a sense of, the importance of the day-to-day combat relative to our lives. And so underneath it all of the partisanship that we see every day, there is a spirit of community and fellowship. And Jim Flaherty was what I like to think of as a twinkle in his eye partisan. He was somebody who was quite capable of delivering a fierce partisan argument, but most days when he would do that, you could tell that he didn't really dislike the person that he was criticizing. And I was thinking today about 2 speeches that for me told me something about him. The first was to a business audience in an event in Ottawa. And it was widely reported because what he did was deliver a fiercely partisan attack on the Liberals, saying that they would be like pirates coming over the deck of the ship and they would put the ship of Canada on the rocks. And even as he was delivering the speech, it was bombing in the room. And it was a mark of who he was as a person that he didn't have to tell his staff, but his people were going around saying, these aren't his words. He was asked to give them. And the other speech was a much more important speech, much more telling about the kind of person he was. He delivered to University of Western Ontario students. And he talked about the value of public service and how being involved in public life was good for you. And he exhorted those kids that he spoke to play that role, to recognize that they could affect the lives of their fellow citizens. If people want to know more about Jim Flaherty, should find that speech online and give it a read. It's a very, very telling speech.
Earlier in the hour, we saw some of the former Prime Minister Brian Mulroney's comments about Jim Flaherty. He also said this. We had this little exchange as well, and it's worth playing again here. Watch this. There are a few days in Ottawa where you see all sides kind of shattered by the same news about one of their own. Do we sometimes, those of us who haven't sat in there, do we sometimes forget that these are just people like the rest of us?
That's right. These guys take a terrible pounding, often for nothing at all, and they have to live through it, go home to their families, and it's not an easy life. And the members of Parliament, members of Cabinet, and the Prime Minister, they give up an enormous amount to serve Canada. And I think that you get an exception every once in a while, but 99.99% of them do it because they love Canada, they think they can make a difference, and they want to help to shape the future of Canada from all political parties, all of them.
I think some people may take issue with the 99.99%, but you get what he's saying.
Yeah, and it is a vast majority of MPs who live these terrible lives of being on planes forever and staying alone in apartments in Ottawa. They don't do it because it's terribly fun. In the case of Jim Flaherty, I think that even people like me who didn't know him personally could see that he was enjoying that life. He thrived on it. He loved it. How many people in this country are there who, when they pass away, will leave in mourning two places of politics, Queen's Park in this case, and Parliament, City Hall and Parliament in the case of Jack Layton? You have to love the life. But what I thought today was great for Jim Flaherty, as opposed to others, is that he left a month ago and people wrote about how he had done as Minister of Finance. He got to read the eulogies of his political career. Most people don't. And saw that, on balance, it was largely positive. And that is a grace that most of us will not have.
He certainly had a zest for it. I mean, even going back to his provincial politics days, I remember that first time he ran for a leader of the Conservative Party in Ontario, and he ultimately was not successful, but he ran an extraordinary campaign, and part of it was just that self-confidence that he would sort of set the agenda each day, had a very bold campaign, and just that kind of Jimmy Cagney kind of strut that he had in his step was hard not to like. I remember just talking to Bruce saying, you know, oftentimes you see politicians who will compartmentalize. They'll be tough as nails in public life, and then they'll be nice and go for a beer with their opponents afterwards. And I'm never quite sure how I feel about that. In his case, it was at one and the same time. He'd be out there in Parliament just tearing a strip off them, but as Bruce said, he couldn't help letting a smile crawl across his face. And that's, as I say, I think when we see that, it's hard not to be drawn to that.
You know, I wonder whether the point I guess I was making with the former Prime Minister was that the people have this image of their politicians based perhaps on the way media reports on them.
Or on the way they behave.
Or on the way they behave, and that's why I'm saying the 99.99 is probably an overstatement. But do we give them an unfair shake in the general sense, politicians?
Well, only, I guess, in the sense that we spend more time talking about what they've done wrong or what's worthwhile criticizing or things that could be done better. And there isn't much attention paid to their basic human qualities, the humanity that you and former Prime Minister Mulroney were talking about. I remember having a conversation with Jim Flaherty. We happened to be sitting beside each other on a plane, and we didn't talk about, for the duration of the flight, we didn't talk about federal policy or politics even. We talked about a couple of things that stood out for me and that were about him as a human being. And Chantal's point about he got to read his eulogies made me think of this, because he actually was thinking about them even back then. This was a couple of years ago. And I remember him saying to me, almost like he was a baseball fan looking at a baseball card of his career and saying, I'm the 7th longest serving finance minister now. And if I stay this much more time, I'll be 3rd and the longest serving Conservative. And that is, in fact, what he accomplished. He stayed and accomplished that. He also talked about Ireland. And seeing your interview with Mr. Mulroney reminded me of that. He'd been over to play golf with some friends and enjoy some relaxation, but he immediately lurched into a discussion of almost how proud he was that Ireland was the first off its feet of the countries that had suffered so much economic disaster in the last several years. And he attributed that to an attitude. And I could tell that what he was saying was, I have that attitude too, that if you don't expect much, you work hard, you can accomplish a considerable amount.
You know, MPs go on a break now. They're in the House tomorrow, but Fridays are usually a pretty quiet day, and then they're gone for a couple of weeks. Does anyone really expect that what we saw today will in any way change the way things go there? No.
The spell will last for a few hours, maybe a day, maybe as long as it takes to have the funeral. But eventually politics takes over. It's just a miracle that it didn't take over today. I mean, it's oftentimes, with someone who is, I think, less genuinely well regarded, sometimes these speeches are a bit pro forma. and people perform the roles, and sometimes you just measure how well they perform. As I say, what was striking to me today is, I mean, you watched Tom Mulcair give that statement. You can't act that. That was not performed. That was him actually, responding. And when he was speaking, one of the things I was struck by, he spoke about him in the present tense. He kept saying he is.
Yes.
That's what you say when you didn't have it all scripted.
You want the last word?
And that's a credit to Jim Flaherty, because it was because of who he was, not because he was the Minister of Finance, sat in the House of Commons, that it happened that way. Moments of grace, Nelson Mandela's death, Jack Layton, they don't last.
Leave it at that. Thank you all.